Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our session on M365 Insights, a solution that we have built to, based on the feedback from our clients on how to help them understand what's inside of Microsoft 365 as the solution overall becomes more complex and there are more bells and whistles, more widgets, more little apps, more pockets of data, and ultimately, how do we know what's inside the environment? So before I get into it, so my name is Lorraine Strant. I'll be taking you through it today. I've been working with 365 since before it was called that, 2 names ago, when it was called BPOS, back in the late O's. I'm a Microsoft MVP, so I work quite closely with Microsoft product groups. And one of the things that I guess I would say is because I've worked with this platform exclusively for so long, I tend to know where the bodies are buried. And that's actually one of the things that's helped this solution come to life, because of the fact that I've been seeing Microsoft develop reporting solutions or show report data in admin centers over the years, and have been a little bit underwhelmed with I guess those reporting solutions over that time. Basically, we just said we need to build our own because it's just not there. And while there are other solutions on the marketplace that exist, they all tend to focus on the same things as well. So what I'm going to take you through today is what's different about that. So the first thing is, how do we know what's being used by who in our organization, where the stuff is, how do we make informed decisions? So what are the apps and services that are being used? Yes, everybody uses Teams and everybody uses Mail and everybody uses SharePoint. Great, but what about all the others? Where is the content being created? Because while while we're actually wanting to see everything inside of Teams, we can add forms in Teams, we can add all these different services and lists and all these bits and pieces. We actually can't see where the content actually exists inside of them beyond, as I said, the big four. When we look at groups and teams, if you try to offboard a team, what are things that you can see out of the box? If you go in the Teams Admin Center, you see Teams information about channels. If you go to the SharePoint Admin Center to look for that associated team, then you'll see things like the associated SharePoint site and how many files are in there and last used, but that's pretty much where it stops. So as I said, outside of the usual suspects, which is Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams, what else do we know what's being used inside of our platform? So the other thing as well is from a governance perspective, we want to know what's being used in the platform, but we also want to know where should we focus activities and efforts around driving improved usage. So how do we know whether to lock certain apps down if we don't know how people are using them? How do we know which tools people should be trained on or shouldn't be trained on because they're using it well enough? And also, as I said, like from those silos of information, things exist. Things are being created in different pockets of different apps across the platform, but we don't necessarily know where those actually are outside of the main ones and everybody creating a team and a channel every time they think of it. And when we delete a group or a team, it seems kind of straightforward. As I mentioned before, we can see some stuff in Teams, we can see some stuff in SharePoint, but what about everything else, especially as Microsoft throws more and more things inside of Teams and says, use Teams for everything. So what happens when we delete it? Because there's a lot more data than meets the eye. Yes, I'm a Transformers nut. So when we look at what's already available from Microsoft, we've got the Microsoft 365 Usage Analytics app in Power BI. It's been around for a number of years. It was previously, I think, the Power BI content, something adoption pack, but it really just focuses on those main 4: Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams. It does look at Yammer as well. It does look at Office and Skype for Business if you want, and shows limited sets of data around it. It's more around usage of it, so total stats of it, total amount of files, total amount of users, total amount of chats, and those kind of things. Now, there are various admin centers where you can go in and dig a bit deeper into this information. Sometimes that data doesn't match up to that M365 usage analytics tool. The other thing is that M365 usage analytics tool requires Power BI and requires anybody who consumes it to also use Power BI. And in order to then get all the different bits of data across from different places, we have to navigate all these different screens. So if you go into the Teams Admin Center, if you go to the Manage Teams, you'll see a list of the teams and the amount of channels and the amount of channels, amount of guests, users, those kind of things. But if you want to see the usage activity or dive in a little bit deeper, you then have to go into the reports section of the Teams Admin Centers. SharePoint is similar. Exchange is similar, and it becomes quite frustrating that you have to go to all these different places to get little snippets of data across the board. You effectively have to be an Excel wizard, so you have to be able to export all these bits of data to Excel and then use things like VLOOKUPs to actually match the data up if it makes sense. And as I said, there are third-party tools out there, but a lot of them really just kind of regurgitate the same information just in different ways and don't often look beyond those common applications. So when we look at what we want to do when we go beyond that native reporting that's available to us from Microsoft, so we want to look at things like what's in our tenant. So we want to see what apps exist for things like Planner. We want to know, how many boards exist there. One of the things that I find fascinating is one of the apps is Bookings. There is absolutely no way of knowing how many people are using Bookings in your environment because in Exchange, they don't show up in the admin center, and in Azure Active Directory, they just show up as an unlicensed user. And that's actually an important thing, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, because you might think Bookings isn't important, but it actually is. Also, OneNote. How many sections and pages are in those OneNote notebooks? Do we need to preserve them? Is it a risk? Whiteboard is an interesting one where, again, whiteboard is really easy in a meeting to just create a whiteboard, but data lives in those whiteboards. Information is captured in those whiteboards. How do we know what happens to them when the person goes? In Power Platform, we've got apps and we've got workflows, and there's also things like Power Virtual Agents and Dataverse and other things coming along, but I'll cover Power Platform in a little bit. Power BI has an immense amount of data that we want to report on that, unfortunately, there is no reporting solution out of the box. So we want to see what workspaces exist, not just the ones that were created, the ones that we know about, but whether if you've got workspace creation unrestricted, anybody can do it. But even if workspace restriction is restricted, what's inside of them? What data sets exist? What reports exist? What dashboards exist? Because there's data in them, their workspaces. Inside of Azure Active Directory, we want to know what apps exist in terms of service principals and app registrations, because while for many instances those are connected, the other thing is anytime anybody approves access to 365, signs into an app using their Microsoft 365 credentials, it's creating a service principal in your environment which has access to your tenant, and depending on what your admin settings are, may have been granted access to more than is required. We also want to know what devices are in there. Yes, we can go into Intune for device management, and we can also go into Azure Active Directory, but things like Intune, for example, has the ability to offboard devices after a certain period of inactivity. Azure Active Directory does not. So one of the clients that has this solution deployed was growing their devices in their Azure Active Directory environment at the rate of several hundred a week because they're a university, and anytime anybody signed into a browser with their university account, it was creating a new device. Now, we're not concerned about Azure Active Directory filling up because it can scale quite a lot, but it just creates a lot more noise and a lot more complexity to work with. Licensing, we want to know what people are using with that. We also want to know what users we have in the tenant, because also we may have stale users. And also a really important one these days is guests. While we do have Microsoft shared channels in Teams, sold as the panacea of external collaboration, we still also have guests in our tenant. Guests have been added from SharePoint or Power BI or Teams, obviously. So we want to know what's inside of those and how many of them are still active and what they have access to. With SharePoint, as I said, we've got the admin center, but SharePoint sites can also have subsites, and also importantly, lists. And lists is becoming more pervasive. Things like this webinar, for example, uses lists to manage the registration. And obviously Teams, I'm not going to go too much into Teams, but the things that Teams doesn't really report on is what apps people are using, both from a user perspective as well as a team perspective. So in terms of users, as I said, what devices they've got, where were they last used, what apps and workflows have been created, what booking calendars do they operate, as they may be actually mission critical booking calendars that you're not aware of. What whiteboards are there, and as I said, what Teams apps have they got, what Power BI reports before you go deleting that user have they got access to, and also one thing that's important is who's sharing their calendars externally, because again, depending on your tenant settings, there may be a lot of information that's privy there. From a groups and teams perspective, what apps have been connected, as I mentioned before, but also what notebooks exist in that group or team, what planner boards exist in there, what SharePoint lists have been created that people may have also connected workflows to, and also what mailbox items exist in the group mailbox that is connected to it. Again, things that are not easily reportable on, or quite difficult to find, and makes it a bit of a challenge to know, can I delete this group, because what gets deleted with it? In terms of Power Platform, we can identify where we've got heavy users, potential champions, but also business continuity risks. Me, for example, in Rapid Circle, I have a lot of workflows in my account. I used to have more because I was a business risk. So a lot of those workflows, we identified them and have now been moved across. Now we do have Microsoft makes available the Center of Excellence Starter Kit, but if anyone's looked at it, it's a very, very heavy solution to implement and keep updated, where sometimes we just want some basic reporting on what exists. Then we've got a bunch of other services that, as I said, what SharePoint sites exist, what apps have access to Azure AD, how many admins are in your tenant. Yes, you can go in and look at different admin roles, but it takes a lot of effort to figure out which admin has access to what, and if you're using something like Privileged Identity Manager, whether it's permanently active or whether they're simply eligible for it. We also want to know how our licenses are being utilized and whether we've got risks with our licenses, like perhaps we're heading towards a low license count for a mission critical license. So this is where M365 Insights comes into, and it effectively provides us it's a Power BI report built on a number of things that I won't get into, but if the opening screen is a snapshot of your tenant that allows you to then dive deeper into it. So from a user perspective, we can see what Teams apps they've got. We can also see what devices they've been connected to. We can also filter by office location. Coming soon, we'll be able to be filtered by manager. So you can actually cut the report up and give it to managers so they can see their staff. Also, what booking calendars exist with that person and what Power BI and Power Platform resources have been created. So this is me here in the tenant. You can see I've got quite a number of Power BI data sets and apps and flows. So I'm a known risk, and some of those risks we're already working on, but I'm not the only risk to the business. Also, we can see what, as mentioned before, calendars that are being shared. Now in Rapid Circle, we have our calendar sharing at an organizational level set to free busy only, but in many organizations it's set to full details, which means that people who have access to calendars can actually see all the appointments in there, everything except private, and they can see the details and attachments and those kind of things. So this gives you the ability to see, before you go changing that setting down to free busy potentially, who that's going to affect. Or who is sharing things with a competitor potentially. In terms of our groups, as mentioned before, there's a lot of resources connected to it. So here in our Microsoft 365 groups screen, we can see what Teams apps have been added to it because there may be data in those apps. We can also see what planner boards are in there and how many buckets and tasks exist in there. We can see what SharePoint sites exist because there actually may be more than one SharePoint site in there, as well as any OneNote notebooks, how many pages and sections they've got in there, because maybe the notebook was left as the default, but maybe people have also created other notebooks in there. And also SharePoint lists, because as I said, that is a huge source of data. In this particular Microsoft 365 group that I've got in the screenshot here, that's one of my groups, and I use lists incredibly heavy heavily in that particular site. So let's say we don't need the site anymore, but there's still workflows connected to the lists and writing data to them. This allows us to see that and make a decision, hang on, before we go deleting that team or that group, there's other stuff we've got to address. As I mentioned, from a license perspective, yes, we can see licenses in the M365 Admin Center, but to give someone in the business that data, they need to have the billing administrator role, which means they can actually go in and change license quantities, purchase new licenses, and those kind of things. Potentially, we just want them to see the visibility of this in terms of what licenses are available and how many are signed versus free, how many of them are free versus paid, because you do get lots of free licenses from Microsoft for certain things. And maybe we want to clean some of those up because we've got paid licenses to replace those. But also one of the features we've added very recently is a license monitoring report, which effectively sends you an email every Monday morning with the weekly summary of the licenses, but also highlights the licenses that are at risk. So where you've got, for example, a certain quantity of licenses, if you're within a certain threshold, it will be flagged as at risk. Now, we do have the ability for you to exclude certain licenses, and also we have a threshold that we don't necessarily report on. So if you've got a very small set of licenses, then maybe you don't want that reported on every week because like say Power Automate per user licensing. I don't need to know every week because we've got 3 of them, it's managed. But others we may want to know about. From an Azure AD apps perspective, we can see where the apps, all the apps that exist as app registrations, as well as service principals, where in the Azure Admin Center, they're in 2 different screens. We can see whether they're connected to each other when they were created. In a future iteration, we will show also what permissions these apps have, as well as who created them and who has access to them. But it makes it a lot easier for us to see that information. Also, we'll be showing which ones are connected to a Teams app as well, so you don't have to go hunting between multiple admin centers. In terms from a guest perspective, while you can do an export of guests, the ability to see when those guests were last active is incredibly difficult to find. And trust me, I know, because if you click on them, you'll see only the last 30 days of usage, because that's all Azure Active Directory actually stores from a front end perspective. So we can actually see how many guests have been active and for how long, and we can simplify the process of purging them because this is Power BI, so it makes it very easy for us to just change the filter, export it to a CSV, and then run a PowerShell script or create something automated based on that. I see a love heart there. Thank you for whoever did that. From a devices perspective, as I mentioned, we've got Intune devices, but we also have plenty of devices that are not in Intune, especially if you're not using Intune. So every device will show up there. While it's not exactly costing us money to have those devices sitting there, even if they're inactive, it just creates more clutter for us and makes it harder for us to manage. So we can do some reporting here on what the type of devices are in our tenant. We can also filter them by operating system, and we can also filter by user as well. So that ties back to the previous user screen. We can see the devices that I had. We can also do it from this particular screen as well. And again, makes it easy for us to simply say, right, filter anything that hasn't been active in 180 days and export it to a CSV and then run a script to just purge it out. Now, one that we added very recently is Privileged Identity Manager. So this shows us all the different roles in Privileged Identity Manager and who they're assigned to, whether they're administrative roles or more of a reader role, and how many of them are eligible versus active. So this is our particular tenant. I've been doing a lot of cleanup of our admins, and trust me, I'm not done yet. But as you can see here, that we have a number of roles that are assigned, which means they're active, they're in use now, versus more of them that are eligible. So ideally, I want to move all those active or assigned ones over to eligible, except in some instances where it makes sense for them to be there. But this particular thing was actually created from a personal need because we had so many different admins in our environment. And if you've looked in PIM, it's not that easy to go through and clean things up. And I was finding I kept having to export to Excel every month or so to have a look through it, work through it. Whereas this, it's just updated for me every week. Now, bookings, I mentioned before, people, every time I mention bookings, don't care about it. But here's why we do want to care. Firstly, people can and will create a booking calendar with the same name as them. What this results in is GAL confusion, GAL being global address list. Because that booking calendar is technically an Exchange mailbox, it shows up in the global address list. So in our particular tenant, we have a naming standard of first name dot last name at rapidcircle.com. So if I go in and I create a booking calendar called Lorian Strant, it will be created as Lorian Strant at rapidcircle.com, because at this point there is no naming policy configuration for bookings. So what this actually means is, and we've seen this happen firsthand in our tenant, but also in client tenants, where somebody goes through and sets a people picker as an approver, and because both Lorians would appear in that tenant, and no, it wasn't me, the person may select the wrong one, because it depends on which people picker is in SharePoint or Teams, whichever one it might be. Some of them will show the name and email address, but it requires somebody to actually look and go, hang on, that email address doesn't have a full stop. It may show the profile photo, it may show the job title, but in lots of cases, it literally just shows you two identically named things. So I've seen a workflow fail where it was routed to the bookings calendar of the user. The user went and clicked on the link because the bookings calendar takes any emails and sends them through to you. They clicked on it and said, no, you don't have the ability to approve this workflow. They're like, but it's my name. Yes, it is, but it's not actually you. The other thing as well is people can create calendars with the same name as the organization. So in this particular report, we actually give you two buttons to filter by names of the people, but also names of the organization as well as acronyms. What's also important with this is, because you have practically no visibility or control over bookings, naming conventions, any of those kind of things, I can quite easily create a bookings calendar called patient admissions at. You'll never know it exists, and any email will be routed to me. I can also, through bookings, capture personal details that things like DLP will not find, because booking calendars are not in scope of DLP. So while this particular report won't tell you the data, it will show you that there is something there and how active it's been, allowing you to actually go and hunt and find that if you like. Especially now that Book With Me is rolling out across Microsoft 365, we're actually internally using it as a way to clean up those booking calendars where people have set things up to have a booking system. So we're using it as a way to clean those things up to avoid future confusion. As I said, nobody cared about bookings until I showed them the data in their tenant, and when they saw the amount of booking calendars with their organization name in there, it just rang alarm bells. So it can be anything: student admissions, patient admissions, payments at, you can make it whatever you want. So Planner, I personally have a bugbear with, because Planner has no ability to recover things properly. It has no version history. We can't work through it properly. And now that Lists actually has a Kanban view built into it, some of our clients have actually used this particular report to identify heavy Planner users, or groups that are heavy Planner users, and actually start to move them over to Lists instead of using Planner. Now, I'm not saying Planner should go away. That's a soapbox I'll get on at another time, but allows you to have that insight as to how well is Planner being used, but also how poorly is Planner being used, because many people will create a Planner and never create any more buckets and just say, oh, it's too hard to manage. And we can now see, well, your Planner board only has one bucket. That completely understands why it's hard to use. Or people have created them and put a couple in there, and now it just clutters their view. So that's the thing, is a lot of this is about both governance and security, as well as user experience and adoption. So this helps us find those Planner boards and remove them, or find a heavy users and say, maybe there's a better tool, and also because maybe there's sensitive data in there. As I mentioned, Power BI, there is no reporting on Power BI in Microsoft 365. If you do happen to go into the Power BI Admin Center, and for that you need to be either a Power Platform admin or a Power BI admin. You can't see the data as a global reader or any other kind of role. The data that's actually shown in there is 28 days worth of data, or 30 days. I can't remember. It's one of the two, but it's a very small window of data. And it only shows you usage in that period. It doesn't show your full inventory. There's literally no reporting on your Power BI inventory. So we've built one. And even the Power Platform Admin Center is unfortunately unrelated to Power BI, despite them being part of the same thing. So we can't see that information in there. And the Center of Excellence Starter Kit, which is created for Power Platform, does not do any Power BI reporting. So this allows us to see workspaces that exist, not just personal ones, but ones that have been created, as well as what's inside of those workspaces, and also heavy users. So you can see in our environment, Tharbor is an incredibly heavy user of Power BI because he's actually one of our Power BI specialists and has been here for 10 years. So it makes sense. One of the things we added for Power BI is duplicate detection. So it can find workspaces and reports and data sets that have similar names. So to help you clean up to determine which one is the real one that should exist. So help you remove the potentially one that was created 6 months ago that it's actually no longer valid because someone created a new one since then. In terms of Power Platform, as I mentioned, we do have the COE Starter Kit, which is an incredibly powerful and very useful solution that we deploy for our clients and also use ourselves, but has also a heavy overhead from an administrative perspective and rights and licenses and those things. So this gives you a simple report that you can share with people outside of the IT team of simply what's inside of your environment, who are your heavy users, what are your risks. So for example, here you can see that Daniel McPherson is our heaviest user. That's because he's one of the founders of the company and so has built a lot of solutions there. That being said, I'd probably at this point use the COE Starter Kit to go and look at his solutions or his apps and flows to identify which ones have actually been active and maybe he should go through and clean them up. But you'll notice that I'm in third place there, and that is because I actually used to be in second place, and no, it's not a competition. I mentioned before that I was a business risk. I had over 150 workflows that were under my account that have now been moved out into a dedicated service account because one day I might leave and all of a sudden business processes would fail. Apart from the world collapsing if I was to leave because my ego is that big, legitimately, we've seen this in clients all the time where people have been offboarded and all of a sudden a business process fails, a workflow fails, an app fails because the account no longer exists. So this allows us to see like that user overview before, or here we can actually dive a bit deeper into it and see it more at a glance. As I said, with SharePoint, we've got the SharePoint Admin Center, but it only shows you the top level sites. It doesn't show you any subsites. And yes, people still do create subsites, but also subsites have existed for quite some time, but also shows you all the lists inside of those sites and how many items are in there. That is crucial as more and more things are showing up in lists and being pumped into them because it's available as a Teams app. It's available in the app launcher. It's very easy to use and very attractive to use. This gives us the ability to see what's where those heavy uses are of those and to clean them up. Whiteboard, I mentioned before, Whiteboard, now that it's moved to OneDrive, is a bit better, but previously your Whiteboard could be in the US, it could be in EMEA, or it could be in Australia, depending on user existence, and that might affect data sovereignty. Also, we can see which whiteboards have been inactive for a period of time, and look, we're not overly concerned about cleaning them up, but every time someone creates a whiteboard in a Teams meeting, it creates potentially more junk for people to figure out. And one of the things that we often don't do is actually clean up after ourselves when it comes to this type of information, not just whiteboards, but all of it, because, you know, the storage just continues to grow in capacity. So we don't care about cleaning up, but we need to clean up after ourselves because it creates confusion. So how does this ultimately look? So you've seen it's all Power BI. The important thing is the data lives in your tenant. It does not live in our tenant. Absolutely must live in your tenant because it's your information. It's refreshed on a weekly basis. The reports are refreshed across the week. So you might see something like a device last logged in 6 days ago while you're actually sitting on the device right now. And that's because we refresh the data on a weekly basis. That's a design decision because in some organizations that is, we have workflows that collect the data that actually sometimes take 2 days, because of the volume of data, like lists, or planner because of the minutia it's going into, or devices because there's hundreds of thousands of devices in the tenant. As I said, it's all presented in Power BI, so you can skin it however you want. You can cut it up and present it to managers or departments, and so they can actually filter, or even we've just added a slicer, you can filter it by office location, and yeah, share it however you like. And yeah, people don't have to have any form of admin role to be able to view the data. It's completely up to you. So that was something that we thought was very important, because a lot of times we don't want people to have the report reader role in 365. We want them to see specific bits of reports. This gives us the ability to control that. Also, we can give it to different departments from an IT perspective. If we can give it to the devices department, we can give it to the security department, so they can actually see the data that's important to them. In terms of what's on the roadmap, I mentioned earlier that from a Teams app perspective, we'll be actually matching that up to the Azure AD service principal. So when you delete the Teams app, you can also delete the service principal, or if you're looking at deleting a service principal, you can see which Teams app it's going to impact. Also covering off the permissions of those service principals and app registrations, as they may see more than you are happy with. For example, in our particular tenant, one of the apps I found had the ability to see all files that a person had access to. So not just their OneDrive, every file they have access to, which means every file in OneDrive that have been shared with them files, but also all the SharePoint sites as well. We're also going to have the for planner activity, so you can see when the planner board was last active. So not just it has 1,000 items in it, maybe they haven't been touched for a year. So we can see that, as well as activity on group and also user notebooks as well, so when they were last modified. So simple. How do you get started with it? Contact your Rapid Circle account manager, because this is available as a standalone solution, but it is also available as part of our M365 managed service, where we can actually then take insights, actually do things about those. So with that is the end of it. So any questions? Damien opened the chat because the Q&A feature in this particular Teams meeting stopped working right before we joined.
There are a couple of questions in Q&A for anyone joining from the app. So if you want to just have a look at those questions there, Lauren, you might want to answer them, or I'm happy to read them out for you.
No, actually it's working now. Bookings. So Barney asking, does this capture data from the recently released bookings with me feature? No, it absolutely does not. But that is absolutely something that I will be looking at doing. That being said, so one of the things we have with this solution is an ideas portal, where you can actually submit ideas for things that you would like to see added or improved or changed. In terms of booking, book with me or bookings with me, I don't know how they call it, changes depending on the screen you're on. It'll probably be added at some point, maybe in the next 6 months. I'm still waiting to get answers from Microsoft on how to get data out of that in the first place. So because not everything is available from a data source. So one of the things we actually do that I forgot to mention is we actually update this every 3 months for new features, new reports, those kind of things. So Barney, you've also asked how often is data updated? So it is updated on a weekly basis. We can potentially change things, but we prefer not to, because I guess if something is more pertinent and urgent, you'd probably be going in to look at it from a particular admin center. In terms of things like PIM, we're not looking at, I guess the reason why I'm happy to leave that one as weekly is because ideally with PIM, you would have alerts set up for people elevating roles and be notified that way of things occurring. This is more looking at what's been assigned to people. However, if you have a use case as to why you think that particular report should be refreshed on a daily basis, not averse to that at all, and that's where the ideas portal comes. Any other last questions people want to post? Well, if no more questions, I'll give everybody 5 minutes back in their day. Thank you for attending. And hopefully it's been useful, and I hope to hear your ideas for things that we can add to it in the future. Thanks very much.